the challenge is we don't have a social space that says men are allowed to say, I was harmed by that.
If you've ever wondered what it takes to engage men and boys in the global movement for gender equality, you're about to hear from one of its most influential voices. Dr. Gary Barker has spent over 30 years on the front lines of gender justice, co-founding global initiatives like Men Care and Men Engage, and leading the world's largest survey on men's attitudes towards violence, fatherhood, and equality. As CEO of Equimundo, he brings sharp insight into how masculinity can evolve and how real change starts with empathy, evidence, and bold allyship.
The armor it's so freaking fragile. It's just like finding the soft spot around. There's a beating heart under there. I know it. I'm not giving up. I'm not leaving the room. For example, on depression and some other mental health needs, men and women experience them in about equal numbers, but men are half as likely to seek support.
For those who are unfamiliar with your work, could you just share a little bit about what you do and then, take us back to where this all began for you? Was there any kind of formative experience that drew you into working with boys and men in the first place?
Stu, thanks for having me. And I'm the founder and CEO of Equimundo, and we're an international organization. We're based in the US, about 20 of us working on men and boys for healthier ideas about manhood. We do research, program development, advocacy, all around this conversation of how do we support men to be our best selves. That includes fatherhood work, violence prevention, engaging young men online, conversations with boys and young men. Those are kind of our big topics. Where did it start for me? Well, I guess the easy one is I don't know whether, if you had one of these, but, if you remember that vocational test you do way back in when you're 12 or 13 and kind of what you think you want to do and be based on what you're interested in. There was not one that I will deconstruct masculinities and be a gender equality advocate. That was not one that was on the test. But, lots of things happened along the way. One was living, adolescent masculinity in Houston, Texas in the late 70s. That included guys who fit into the stereotype that you would think about South Texas in that era, and a lot of guys who don't fit into those stereotypes, including myself. I witnessed a school shooting in my high school in the late 70s, a young man with a gun and lots of challenges, and it was kind of an honor killing carried out in front of a group of 100 of us. Accused the other of stealing his girlfriend, and he would make him pay. Oh. We didn't talk about it. We went back to class half an hour later, and the normality of South Texas life went on. Justice taken out with a gun, a young man taken away to juvenile detention, and the rest of us back to class. A couple of years later, freshman year at a big state university in the same said state, Friday night, lots of young people learning how to drink or how not to drink. A group of guys take a young woman back to their room and sexually assault her. When people knew what the university did was close to nothing. And there was a kind of some moments of wake up in my head of how do we make men so? What is this thing that, why do we feel the silence, this is normal, why do the men who are around who don't believe in this stuff, why do we feel this kind of oppressive wall of silence? I worked with, the first part of my career was with survivors of violence and a lot of work with women and girls, because that's where we kind of framed the work. And it was some years later working with feminists, women in Latin America in particular, in Brazil, who said, we need men as part of this conversation, talking about men, talking about manhood. We don't need you here to save us. Please keep your white horse in the stable. None of that. You are not coming to save us. Maybe you can save yourself, but could you, march side by side with us to do work together around equality, better ideas of manhood, ending cycles of violence. And so the conversations that started that work that led to us creating first the organization called Promundo and now Equimundo, a lot of them started, in Brazil in the early 90s with some amazing feminist activist women who said, we need you at the table and let's figure out what we do together.
Wow. I've had goosebumps recounting some of those stories, both from the depths of the trauma I can imagine that would be present, as well as, the women calling you in and
Yeah,
saying,
yeah,
there needs to be men here at the table if we're going to talk about gender equality. The other 50% also has to be involved in this conversation, which I think is a beautiful shift to one that empowers everybody at the table to make the needed changes.
absolutely. And a tough one, right? Because I think it didn't feel, and it still in many spaces doesn't feel like the normal or the next progression. Because I think as we frame so much about gender as somebody's got all the power and they own it in a bottle somewhere, and somebody doesn't have the power and their bottle is empty, right? We get into this kind of hydraulic zero sum game that it gets really tough to say it's all relational. And power is a much more diffuse thing. I'll sometimes rant at with friends at dinner going, but it's men that start war. And I'll say, not the 13-year-old child soldiers that I worked with in Uganda. They didn't start it. So that framing that men this or patriarchy that is true, and yet it doesn't get us to a nuanced approach of,
Mm-hmm.
well, which men have power, and how are they using that power, and what is the other pieces of power that some men may have, but also where they're also disempowered, and that makes a much more complex conversation than just men are all this and patriarchy is one big monolithic thing sitting over somewhere, and men feeling a sense of guilt, shame that patriarchy means me because I'm a man, and patriarch means the man in charge, and so I must be that, and all the words that feel like they box men into a space that we're all the same, sitting over, we come somehow sitting on this big amassed power that most men don't perceive they have.
That's right. And I think men have developed a lot of shame. A lot of men have experienced a lot of shame for just being born as a man, for the justified anger and rage of certain oppression and certain decisions that have been made, that some men have made, that have impacted, had a global ripple, I guess we
Yeah,
could say. And I guess that's part of why conversations like this are required, to peel back the layers of nuance, because there is, despite there being truth in the statement, of the patriarchy, or this aspect that masculinity or men are toxic or negative, there's a lot more nuance there. And
yeah.
there's a lot of men who are really struggling behind the scenes. And you've traveled the world, you've listened to men all across the world. And even when you strip away the data and the cultural noise, like, what do you feel is the most unspoken pain or struggle that many men are carrying today?
I mean, it fits a little in what I talked about before, sort of the silence, right? That there is no, you don't make it through boyhood, and I would, this holds a lot with girls as well. You don't make it through our childhoods without having some kind of deep pain. For a third of households in the world, that is boys and girls who have witnessed a man in the household use violence against their mother, and the terror that invokes in younger children around the main protector and caregiver of me is unable to defend herself against this more powerful man. And so, a man's act of violence against a female partner usually is witnessed by children in the household or known about. So there's that pain. Boys, we know that, part of growing up, school, after school, communities we live in, at home, is some physical violence from another man or boy, right? It's kind of the hazing that they learned, they pass on to us. And then if we venture out into the further world, we've asked this in surveys, you've witnessed some other kind of harm, right? We're just in a world that cycles of violence pay forward. And, the challenge is we don't have a social space that says men are allowed to say, I was harmed by that. It's not the same as being the woman who was harmed physically by that violence from a man or harmed by sexual violence, but it's there. And the silence, I think, about men's, the kind of the violence that most of us will have experienced, that is, it either happened in our body, it was a threat of it, or we witnessed it. You kind of don't get through boyhood without one of those happening to you. We use a group education activity that we use called the violence clothesline, where we ask guys to do this, like write down a violence, what kind of violence you witnessed, one that you experienced, and if you feel comfortable enough, one that you carried out. and we hang them on strings in the roof, and then without putting your name on them, so you don't know who said it, you walk around and read them, and everyone just goes, like, we've all seen this, we have all lived this. I don't think I've ever done that activity that a guy didn't have one of them. I don't think I've ever had a guy say, I've never had any of these things happen to me. So I think that universality of the harms we experience, because it's part of, kind of the toughening of our hide to make us these versions of men that the world believes we need to be, involves some trauma that we need to acknowledge. What's the space that we get to talk about? So that's where I would start so that we don't get stuck in the pain. I think the other universal is that let's talk about who cared for you and who you care for. And there, I think, is another universal of even in settings where women are doing a vast amount of the care work, or the 1 in 3 households in favelas in Rio, where I worked for many years, which kind of is the same as urban South Africa and kind of is the same as low income urban US, where biological fathers are absent. There's caring men around. And you've got in your head somewhere an internalization of a man who was more caring. And then talk about how do you care for others? So I guess if you make me pull 3 threads through of all guys, those are the ones we need to talk about. Harm, who cared for you, and who do you care for? If we get you opening up on that one, the session's going for hours, right? I think those are kind of our 3 universals.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And like you said, also having the space where those conversations can take place. I found, I facilitate retreats and spaces where men gather, and we do a lot of different practices, but some of the most powerful stuff I've witnessed is just sitting in circle and having an opportunity for men to
Yeah,
share why they're here or what's going on in their life, not
yeah,
just the details, but the depth of how those things are impacting them.
yep,
And almost just seeing the weight that is being liberated from this man just to say that, oh, me too. Oh, I'm not
yeah,
alone.
yeah,
Like that alone is such a liberation that I
yep,
see time and time again.
yeah. No, the the other moments that I rant at my friends or others, it's like, oh, but men just won't talk. Or we'll try or the number of programs often led by women but not always, who in the ways they've seen them done, workplace TI sessions, group education sessions led in schools, et cetera, where they weren't able to, for a variety of reasons, not to point fingers, but just it was kind of impossible to achieve a feeling of safety for men, and so it was just long silences. And I've tried to say, yeah, but if you can create that safe space, I inevitably have to cut off the talk,
Right.
right? I am once you've created that safe space and a couple of guys in the room who are like them, from fill in the blank, former combatants in Rwanda to police officers in Rio de Janeiro to sheriffs in Kansas, if somebody can create that safe space, guys will talk. Even in
Mm.
the most stereotypically kind of hyper masculine places, guys will talk. And it may take you a couple of tries before you figure out, oh, let's talk about their kids. Because there's some other political stuff that's in the air. But if I ask them about their kids, they're ready to talk about, tell me what you're worried about your daughter. And then, dot, 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 or about your son. And then we can, so I absolutely agree. I think the armor it's so freaking fragile. It's just like finding the soft spot around. There's a beating heart under there. I know it. I'm not giving up. I'm not leaving the room until or it might not be today. It might be the next session, because they could be. There often are a couple of guys who are really shy at first. If they're comfortable enough to come back, they're back and they're talking.
That's so true. And I really have kind of adopted the term lead with vulnerability.
Yeah.
If I can be that permission slip and
Yep.
model what it's like to peel back layers, because,
Yeah.
I still have that internal conflict,
Yeah.
like of sharing, but
Yep.
creating the space and the conditions with the right agreements and the right setting where it's like, okay, I can feel safe. And other men through their shares are giving me permission to do the same, and just the liberation that comes through. And I think another thing that, I'm not a father yet, but I've chatted with many fathers about this, and a similar realization seems to take place for many that, oh, every human was a little kid at some point.
Yeah.
Right. It's like a kid who wanted to play and dream and felt and
Yeah,
expressed.
yeah,
So maybe getting more curious than judgmental of, well, what happened to turn that, why did they armor up and why did they put the layers on that,
yeah,
you know, they had to feel the need to protect themselves.
yeah. I will sometimes use, and I used in my TED talk, a picture of some boys looking at the world with that wide-eyed curiosity that 3 and 4 and 5 year olds have before, and that there is a developmental phase, right, that I think is quite important in that moment when kind of before, often before boys are kind of off in the bigger peer groups and off at school, and we're kind of pecking order and competition for spaces kind of kicks in. That early phase is just the world is mine, and let me go into it with totally just the wide-eyed, you know mouth open. You'll say, "Where's your mouth so open? You're catching fly." All the kind of stuff that a grandparent would say to make fun of you. And they're like just so open to the world,
Mm.
and how to kind of free some older men to go, "Oh, let me remember that endlessly curious version of me that felt the world was taking care of me and it felt safe." And not all boys have that. There's lots of some young boys who have early childhood adverse experiences that may not feel that, but so many boys, those early years, yeah, they're full hearted, they're out there, they're curious, they don't feel like they're not yet feeling like homophobic slurs are being used against them, or they're not yet being called "that's so gay" or "that's a girly thing," or it's still safe for them. How do we hold on to that for longer for boys? I think is a really key question.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess along the same vein of that, I mean, you've worked both in war zones and in boardrooms and everything in between. What have you learned about trauma, like whether communal is the experiences you've shared before, or the quiet and domestic stuff that happens behind closed doors,
Yeah,
and how that shapes a man's identity?
yeah. One of the way, as we look at sort of gender differences of how men and women, again, huge differences by individual and setting, et cetera, but we do know that men are much more likely to externalize trauma into violence and harm against others, and that our forms of self harm also have kind of gender spaces, right? Girls and women may withdraw into silence. In some cases, there's self harm that's in the form of cutting, often hidden. So, kind of, you don't see me doing this. Suicide attempts may be a call for help, but they're not a terminal. Like, I can't even talk about it. And then we have a lot of, kind of spaces where women feel like they can go for help to other women. We know that, for example, in depression and some other mental health needs, men and women experience them in about equal numbers, but men are half as likely to seek support. So,
Mm.
one is just this: we're not considered that we're supposed to seek support. And for the number of men for whom trauma converts into harm against others, we too then frequently move from seeing you as a survivor or a victim to you're becoming the perpetrator. And we make these kind of polar opposites instead of understanding that almost every perpetrator is himself a victim of some kind of violence. And in saying that, we're not making an excuse for your use of violence. We are saying you must be held accountable for the harm you carry out, but we know that helping you overcome it means I've got to look at the trauma that's there. And for good reason, a lot of our framing of holding men accountable for harm has turned into you individually responsible for your actions. We need some punitive approach that keeps you from doing more harm. And what we end up missing is the chance, and most of those are individual based. Some of those are group based, and they can be quite effective, but often the group based ones are we put you with other men who have had similar problems of coping and dealing with trauma. So when we put you in a group of fellow men who have carried out violence, and I'm deliberately not using the word perpetrator because I think it's a bit labeling and restricting, but essentially we're putting together the men who have had similar problems of coping, and we're finding the importance of processes where in the group setting there are high coping men and lower coping men. So there's men like you who have found ways of support, conversation, restoration in their communities that they can point to that are around you. Obviously, a group setting with a thoughtful facilitator, co facilitators, all with men who have carried out violence, can do lots of stuff. But I think partly it's a bit like the criminal justice approach of we put other men who have carried out misdeeds together with other men who have carried out misdeeds. Might not be the best pathway to finding the better manhood around us.
Mm.
So I do think there's a huge moment of making it safe for you to talk about it, helping you feel that there are other men who have gone through this who can help you through it. They've got some better skills than you have. You could learn from them. And it's really important if the them is not necessarily me, the middle class white guy from wherever, trying to impart to you who's come from a different setting. I should be a facilitator, but the skills and the learnings can come in particular for from other men like you. And then I think if you set it up that way, which therapeutic processes you go through, lots of them show effect and impact. But it is that safe space giving you the space to, I mean, the universals of overcoming trauma that, there's plenty of folks, whether it's, Body Keeps the Score and others around creating that safe space, allowing a making new meaning from the trauma that you've experienced. And then the third phase of growth, that's universal.
Yeah.
It's the how we set up the setting where this can happen that becomes really key. And I'm so much about reintegrating guys by not separating them in the first place.
Mm.
You got to stay in community. We do so much to boys that you mess up at school, we give you a timeout, which separates you from the tribe. We give you detention, which puts you in the tribe of the bad boys. We expel you, which says you don't even get to be here anymore. Juvenile detention stuff is so often that as well. And then prison,
Mm.
right? A whole system that just takes you away from the rest of community. So I think it's about staying in the room. I think a trauma support and we call you out for harm, but you do not leave community. You are with us in community here. Maybe the best model, and then I'll stop on this topic, was my daughter's school in Brazil. It was a very kind of alternative pedagogy, and they had no traditional punishment that looks like what I'm guessing. I'm gonna guess Canada's similar to the U.S. in that, right? Of the
Yes.
timeout, the normal kind of stuff. It was we at the end of the day, the students sit together with the fellow student in their class, and they would sit around in what was called the tribe. And based on indigenous Brazilian traditions, and they had a replica of the big house where the villages in most indigenous groups in Brazil would resolve disputes. And they did the version that 9-year-olds do of fill in the blank. Joaquin, you beat up on or you said something that was harmful. We talk about it here in group and we listen and we help you. But he's not expelled from the tribe. He is in the group. And I think it's much more complicated than that, but I think there's a really simple piece of truth in that one of just you caused harm, but you never stop being a part of our tribe.
Mm. Wow. That's profound. And I think that's both, a microcosm and a macrocosm, because one of the things that was really coming through there, well, we talked about shame prior to the call starting, and this idea of mentorship or positive guidance and positive role models, which were desperately lacking, that we could point to for, many, many men to be able to look to. And I also think of, our punishment system in general, which is like punitive rather than restorative,
Yeah.
and to really get to the root of, why is going on, and helping that man understand the impact that his actions are having. Because I think too, somebody who's often labeled a perpetrator, as you said, is got at some point a victim, and at some point too, they're also feeling powerless.
Yeah.
And so Marshall Rosenberg in Nonviolent Communication, who when I was in education really stuck with me, he said a poor behavior is often a poor expression of an unmet need.
Yeah.
I think just creating the space where that can be spoken to and leaned into rather than silenced and shut down and shamed is such a transformational way of thinking that I think would do wonders for us at the individual level, the communal level, and even more broadly.
Yeah. I mean, helping, boys and men, I'm not that women and girls naturally have this and have to learn it too, but I think for boys and men in particular, the kind of learning a deeper emotional vocabulary
Right.
and kind of what am I feeling that is, sending me to the edge of rage or anger or some outburst, and how do I one just kind of body awareness of feeling like, oh, this is what it feels like when I get to that moment. And so one is, whether it's, I think mindfulness has become a really useful one around, I am feeling when I'm getting to this point, and either at the very least we can get you to figure out, ooh, I got to walk away and count to 10, or walk away and take a half hour walk. And even if I don't have better words when I come back, at least I've kind of done some self regulation
Mm.
and calm myself down with some deep breaths and walking in the woods or wherever it is I'm walking. Helps if you have some woods around. Not everybody does, but and the other is just that I've got to have language around it. So the self awareness of, and it is what good interventions with men who have carried out violence. They also include that awareness of what is it that gets me to that trigger, and how to. So the first part is that self awareness of it. These are the symptoms I begin to feel when I'm getting to that point, and then the other is, well, we'd like you not to get to that point. What is it? What kind of words and ways to talk about things do you need where you can express that complexity of stuff that's going through your head in a way that, and to figure out where, who it is that you're talking about it with. It may be that your partner that you're using violence against, or might, or think you might, is not the one who can help you with some of that stuff. But maybe they can help you with, or maybe they just need to know some stuff. But how do you have a deeper emotional vocabulary that allows you to acknowledge, ooh, I think this thing that I'm feeling, we should call it a deep sadness. And I'm having trouble, I feel ashamed. And maybe that's the other word that comes out, because I really don't think I'm supposed to show you that I'm sad. And I really feel I'm less than a man if I show that. And so, how to help men have the kind of emotional courage and the emotional vocabulary to go into that deeper. Um, and then it can't just be, and then also how to work in dialogue with whoever we're in dialogue with to move on, well, or to move. That it's not just I experienced this growing up and this is who I am is not the answer. It is, where am I in that, and
Right.
where can I move next?
Mm.
Um,
I like that. For me, I think of the difference between expressing and explaining as well.
yeah,
You know, we've heard the
yeah,
term mansplaining, right? But you never
yep,
hear manspressing.
right.
um,
I think the having I'm not a therapist. I work with a lot of therapists. We've co-created groups together. It can also get stuck where we can start to fall in love with our with our trauma in a way, right? That we
mm,
can we look at it, we hold it up to the light, we look at it again. We can get stuck in that moment of, okay, now I have a vocabulary about it. We've got to help you move. So what do we now? Where do we move to? And I think that's kind of the third phase in most trauma processes is I've got to acknowledge where I came from and to acknowledge that trauma, but we cannot get stuck in this kind of um, now that I've got a vocabulary around it, all I want to do is talk about it. We've got to say, what comes next? What is next in this, where you are in your life and your relationships? And there is life after.
mm,
Step into that. Harm you've caused or that's happened to you. It's not like, an impatient therapist giving you 15 minutes to say, get over it. That's not it either. But it does need to say, you can't remain stuck there.
yeah.
And we're going to help you get to the next place.
I think that's a really critical piece to touch on because I find sometimes I've observed that in the men I work with and even women around me can get stuck on that. You know, you find the words and the relief to be able to name something that for so long has kind of operated in the shadows or unconsciously, that's something that you couldn't really name. And so there's something liberating or relieving, I guess, at
Yeah.
the very least, to be able to name it and to know, oh, I'm not alone in this. This is a pattern and something I'm experiencing. And I think I resonate a lot with what you're talking about is not just looking backwards to
Yeah.
understand why this happened, but where do I really want to go in my life? What kind of direction? What's a sense
Yeah.
of purpose? Something that can
Yeah.
compel me forward and give me reason to shift the story, to shift the
Yeah.
narrative into something that is more constructive and life giving.
Yeah. Indeed. If and I shared, a moment in my life of witnessing the shooting, it was many years that I did kind of a typically, I don't know, fill in the adjective, is a typically masculine thing, a typically Western thing of I talked about the facts of what happened. What
Mm-hmm.
were the details of that day, right? And maybe that's the American obsession with a police procedural. We tell, we tell what happened of a horrible thing, and it was years and that is my current partner of 30 years who asked me, "What did you feel about it?"
Mm-hmm.
So it went from a what happened to what did you feel about it, and kind of going, oh, why did I never, why have I not felt I had that moment to say, oh yeah, that's, and then the other part, and I will say she is a therapist, not my therapist, but very useful of kind of like, if I ever go sort of, I don't know, if I get stuck in it, she's very provocative of like, but you're much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And can't we like, all right already? Can't we can't we move on to a next? Like, okay, you've mentioned that, and honey, can we not, can we now move to the next piece of the conversation of like also just not, and I think that's the communal part of
Right.
our journey as men, that we should not get in this, and that's what men also are often encouraged to do. It's just like go fix yourself. Um, and if I can just, the same way that I will work on, I want to get bigger triceps, kind of, I can work on my coping skills by myself of thinking about this. Nope, no, dude, this is a group sport.
Mm-hmm.
This one you're working on here is not just you and the barbells, you and the weights, right? This is you and the rest of us here. So how do I in community or in my relationship or in my family, right, also get better at um, I need to know what you think about this and what we're doing together and how we're moving on together. That it's hard to do that. This is not, you need a spotter. You gotta have a spotter in the room with you on this one. And including somebody who's there to say, you're getting stuck, you're getting self-absorbed, and we need you here because there's some people depending on you. And I think that's when I feel men step into their best, when I acknowledge I owe you something because of the community I'm in with you, whether I'm your parent and you need me to hold my shit together because because you are the fragile one here, dude, and you got to just step up to it. And that's a version of male grit. I can call it toughness or whatever, that I'm like, step into the traditional version of manhood, guy, because right here, I need you to hold this piece together because you've got somebody else who really needs you in the room with them, alert and getting past your own stuff for a moment, um, to be the next phase of you.
Mm.
Um,
Wow. There's so much there to tease apart. I think of that, sometimes it is that moment where you just need to not make it about yourself.
yes.
Right. And it's just like,
Yes.
okay, all of a sudden it's no longer about me in this moment. So my
Yeah.
little pity story, all these things that I've been
Yep.
stewing in and holding me back.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Because men, there's a part of us that wants to step up and serve and to be there and
Yeah.
to hold the space. So I think that's there. And one thing you mentioned too that resonates a lot with, and the way I've been sharing it is similar. Is like I've spent my life sharing details and rarely the depth of how things are going on. And paradoxically, I've longed for connection and to be seen by others in my life. And I'm
Yeah.
realizing that I had never really given people the chance to see me because I never shared. I gave sprinkles of vulnerability, but never the depth of how things were actually impacting me. And being able to do that and practice that in the safe space, practice that in the container so that I could, just like I practice for sports, to be able
Yeah.
to do that in that setting that's controlled where my nervous system is more regulated, and then to bring that into the wild, into life, so to speak, is such a powerful tool. And for me, being with men and practicing that, it shortens the gap from when I fall flat on my face and when I pick myself back up again.
Yes, which will happen in every, young man's life, boy's life, woman's life as well. Don't mean to, we're not the only ones who have these, but I think we're much. I've been very worried with young men at the moment. I'm also working on a book about young men in the U.S. at the moment, and this sense of isolation and the relationship recession and all the gravitating toward so many harmful voices online. Of worried about, there's a lot of guys talking about Stoicism
Right.
as well. I'm reading a lot about Stoicism, and then I asked them to talk about what do you understand about Stoicism, and the way they talk about it is really not what the philosophy itself is all about, which is it's so much me working on myself. Like I'm going away, I'm not I'm not going out I'm not having any intimate relations. I'm not looking for, if I'm heterosexual, I'm not looking for girls at the moment. I'm working on myself. And I was like, the Stoicism that I read about is a lot about my ethical connection to others.
Mm.
It's about a right way of living with others. And the with others part has sort of disappeared in that. And so I think I want you to, again, I'm going to go back to that, that metaphor of, I want you to go back to working on your own care muscles, right?
Mm.
I want you to, but you can't care by yourself. I need you to care. I need you to be relational. You've got to be with others. And somehow there's a kind of, there's this kind of fitness can fix it all approach that I can go to the gym and not think I need a spotter, or that we've made it into an individual sport when human relations are never an individual sport. I mean, you may have gotten stuck in the jungle like our whatever that Japanese soldier who didn't know for 40 years that World War II was over. Okay, he was on his own. Okay, the rest of us are out here with everybody else. So I need you to kind of step out of that and go, no, I can't. Stoicism is not, is not a lone sport. It's with others, and that's the part I think where we got to figure out, like, why is it that young men feel like they can go it alone,
Right.
and they also are feeling, well, they know they can't go it alone, but they're stuck in I've just, because I'm afraid to get called out, and I'm afraid to be in this relationship or be over here because I'm going to get called toxic or this, then I'm going to try to fix myself. And you want to step in and just like hold them and pull them through the screen and go, nobody can fix themselves.
Mm. Mm.
It's not possible.
No, it makes me think of a man that I've worked with quite a bit. Dewey Freeman often says, "We're wounded in relationship and we heal in relationship."
I love that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really hits home,
Yeah.
and that's so much. As much as I think it's understandable, also because it feels safer to do this in the
Yeah.
isolation,
Yeah.
right? And you want to do this and show your best self to the world, but to
Yeah.
understand that, like, I need to show all of me, not just the polished
Yeah.
parts. And those are
Yep.
actually the parts that people are going to stick to and relate to,
Yeah.
anyways.
Exactly. I mean, I think we've had this, the way that we are raised as boys in most places and young men is this sense that there's a jury of men somewhere
Mm.
holding us up to be this idealized version of manhood.
Mm.
And it shows up a lot in the peer group that will laugh at you or make fun of you or, but it's also internalized in our head, right? Because of media images we have. And there's somehow this version of perfect men that we think exist someplace. And, the utility of working with young men to say, that guy who's driving that car and he's doing that, that video on YouTube, he rented that car for the day. And all the sex and women he's saying he's getting, if he is, he's really empty inside at the end of the day, probably. And he's probably also exaggerating by at least, X percent. So one, we've got to help you kind of put down the idealized version and the judgment that feels to come from other men. And then we added on that the moment of Me Too, which historically was the moment the world needed, which was we couldn't sit in silence when men caused harm. And men in power and men around us need to be called out for harm. It's a good for the world that Me Too and the collective years of feminism made this impact.
Hmm.
And at the same time, as we talk to young men in the US, our data finding 3/4 of guys, we're just about 70%, think their reputation can be destroyed with a single comment. So they also think that half of them are ready to get rid of DEI because it's felt to them like an indictment of men. Um, because often some of it needs to happen. I'm absolutely in favor of it, but it's often felt like a we indict you and kick you out instead of a I'm calling it harm because I want you to be a better human, and I'm demanding in this community we have, if it's a workplace or it's a sports group or it's a school or it's a family group, I'm demanding that you be better because I care about you, because I care about this community that we're part of together. I might be pissed as hell at you, but I care about this community that we've created together. And that's a spouse angry at a man who's abusive or absent or all the above, or in a school setting, she may not be or he may not be ready to have that guy be part of the community, but she cares about the community. So I have to say, we made this together. We're part of this together. I'm calling you out to stay in. So again, I think young men are in this kind of perfect storm where manhood was already tough enough because we got to live this version that nobody can live up to. And then we felt called out in a way that's mostly felt, even though it's not been intended this, it's often felt vindictive or silencing rather than stay in the room because accountability here is relational
Hmm.
and we're going to keep you in community as we call you in. So I think so many guys have just felt that the default, the safe space, is just to stay in the corner and be quiet and work on myself. Because, man, every time I step in this room, it feels like somebody gets called out. And that's really hard to explain to or share with a lot of women who have made the need and fought for the necessary space for men to be called out for harm, that our way of calling men out for harm has got to say, we're in this together.
Right.
We're here. We've got a community together, and that my accountability is not going to be easy, and it's going to be gut wrenching at times for all of us. But I'm doing it because I believe in the shared humanity that we have, and I'm not going to let you walk away.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that that's so spot on, and it ties back to that. This maybe this collective grief of the loss of the village. Like
Yeah,
when I was thinking of how you were talking about the school and
yeah,
the Brazilian communities, just like, oh well, I'm living next to this person, and my life is intertwined with them, so their
yeah,
success is my success, and
yep,
we almost seem to have become removed from that and unable to grieve or to reconcile the fact, well, money has been able to replace relationships in so many ways,
yeah, yeah,
and it's quite beautiful in ways that we can do wonderful things with money, but at
yeah,
the same time, when that fundamental part of what makes us human, this relational aspect, can almost become abstracted into the background and something that we're not really prioritizing, that, like, rising tide lifts all boats here, and we really
yeah.
need we my success is your success, truly.
And even yeah, even just sort of knowing our neighbors, and the number of young men who tell us their online lives are more interesting than their offline lives. And
Mm,
I think there's a lot of community you can build online, but I'm also a developmental psychologist who, I know that our what happens in our bodies, being physically in the same space with other humans, is a massively different impact on our well-being than being on a screen together. And I think, there's a lot of human connection we can make on screens, but it doesn't substitute, the fullness of sharing physical space and sharing activities together beyond all the fun stuff you can do, whether it's games or building stuff or riffing on each other's, blog spots. Yes. But, we got that physical space is so missing.
yeah.
Um, the third of young guys in the US who tell us they don't see anybody outside their household on a weekly basis. I mean, what does that tell us about where we go, right? Even, I was talking with a friend about there's now this obsession with tracking your packages, right? Like, when will my package get here? And the kind of the fascination with where in the chain is it? And I was thinking about, well, it's kind of like when you buy something at a, when we still do this, but if you think about the small store, if you think about when you encountered somebody, or the farmer's market, if that's where you go, or if you're buying an art or a craft at a craft fair, you ask about it. And even if you don't, the seller will tell you something about this was made by these folks over here. And
Right.
the whole selling of it is like where it's from. And there's an interaction there that's like, oh, there's a community someplace that might be close by that made that, even if it's far away, you're kind of representing them and telling me about them. And now I'm tracking my package from Amazon. And I've got no connection with that human anymore who made the thing, right? That went from 14 places before it showed up at my house. It's we're not going to go back to the village. Well, who knows? Maybe we can't go back to the village, but just like how we need some small acts um, of connecting up with others. And I think for boys and men, it's particularly like, okay, it kind of goes with how we've been raised as boys and men anyway. So yeah, whatever. Sure, I can I can go over there and be alone.
Right. On that topic, I mean, you've been, as you're saying, you're writing a book, and obviously you've been doing a lot of research and probably narrowing in. I'm curious to see what's some of the most alarming stuff that you're seeing in terms of, more and more men are moving to incel communities, online communities where they're getting that validation.
Yeah.
And, if they're, whatever stories they're hearing, they're getting it validated probably in unhealthy ways online. And I'm curious, what are some of the most alarming trends that you're seeing in isolation, in this mass migration into those spaces?
I think the backdrop for it was two of the findings from our survey, and we use these often as questions with young men in both online focus groups and some in-person interviews that we did. Two of the most alarming stats were the 2/3 to 3/4 of men who feel like no one really knows me well.
Wow.
Um, and that's the higher numbers among the youngest men. Now that's, I mean, part of human life by the fact that we're these, separate biological things whose bodies we're not empaths, right? We are bounded physical bodies, right? That it's a part of becoming aware about the world. And oh, ultimately I'm going to be away from my parents and my tribe, and I'm going to have to go some of this on my own. So nobody really knows me in this confusing passage to adulthood. It's kind of a normal part of human life. Young women feel that too, in almost equal numbers. They have a lot more friends, a
Mm.
lot more people they
Mhm.
share that with. They're kind of that adolescent young adult existential angst. One is it's happening later with young men. It's lasting longer. And in terms of when I find what I am coming out the other end of that, I'm confused, feeling a bit alone. If you want to do the Joseph Campbell hero quest, they're stuck in that lower arc of it, like, and there's no mentor.
Mm.
The other part that feels really worrying is the 75% of guys who say no one really cares if men are okay these days. And half of women agreed with that too, that no one cares if men are okay. So you're in, kind of your normative adolescent development moment and young adult moment where you're trying to figure out, okay, I'm not that. I got to figure out my space somewhere out there. I'm not finding anybody along the way. And more than that, no one really seems to care if I'm okay.
Wow.
That combination of stuff, you're like, well, what does that lead to? Well, that's the and add to that stat that I just shared of how many feel like I'm going to be called out. A group of guys we spoke to in the middle of the U.S., they're like geographic center. There's a group of them who said, we're just not even dating because we don't want to be that creep.
Mm.
Like you step over the line, and they've seen some of their peers have their reputations, destroyed online by either stuff that was stupid and they should have thought about, but also just kind of not really appropriate accusations.
Mm.
Um, and so going into the, like being so worried they were going to be seen as that creepy guy because they'd seen that other guy's reputation destroyed by having to change schools because he's known as, and basically calling him out for sexual assault that he didn't carry out. And There are lots of men who carry out sexual assault and don't get called out. There's no question we got to work on that. But a lot of guys so worried that anything they do wrong in the world of dating is going to get called out that they're just like they've given up on it in general. So add all those things together, right? Of it's a very frightening perfect storm. Um, Body stuff as being where you so where guys hanging out, the gym. If you were to, throw a rock right now and it was to hit a young man in the US, he's going to be in the gym or he's going to be online or he's going to be online in the gym, right? It's where we're going. It's where we're hanging out. Some of that's group stuff. A lot of it's me, myself, my device, the weight machine, me, myself, my device, the weight machine,
Right.
back home. The utter loneliness of guys that we talk to, particularly right after high school, that secondary school moment. Fewer guys going into college, marriage is happening later, meaningful relationships later. So a lot of guys just lost in that kind of 18 to 25 moment.
Mm.
Um, and so we've got to figure out how we, like no, more panic, less panic, more listening. And I think when guys do feel like we care about them is because we think they're problems. You
Right.
care about me because you're afraid of me, not you care about me because you see my deep humanity, right? And the kind of how much I think we've boxed guys into a space where they feel like you think I'm a feral creature, and you care about me when you're afraid of me. Adolescence as an amazing TV show. If you've,
Right. Yeah.
I mean, just like what a tale of humanity, and for me, it's a tale of a father among two fathers, in fact. Um, but it's also it just keeps repeating the worst of men. And I love it as a show, and I, only praise for the writers. I think they did a brilliant piece of TV. Um, but we got to show the best of young men's humanity. Just like being afraid is not going to do it. Um, and young men know that we're afraid of them. They know that. They're perceiving that we don't care about them. And so that's, I keep referring to ranting with my friends because I like when I hear the stuff repeating, like, no, don't go that way. Love him.
I feel that honestly
Yeah.
because I really really enjoyed watching that show Adolescence, and for good reason. I mean, the cinematography is incredible, and it really hit a chord. And what worries me, I actually did a piece on this not too long ago, is like what's been happening in the UK as a result, because that
Yeah.
fictional documentary series is now starting to inform real world policy there,
Yep.
and they're talking about maybe showing it across the UK in schools as if this is the example of what happens, and
The cautionary
a
tale. Yeah.
cautionary tale, exactly. And there's not
Yeah.
actually documented cases that show that particular archetype, that
Yeah.
individual being the biggest threat in that situation. And again, it paints it more, I think, from the problem lens than it does from a deeper understanding about it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like you said, listen to this boy, understand him, so that he doesn't continue to wall up and to armor off. And I'm curious, like you've spoken about positive masculinity, and if you had to define like what truly mature masculinity looks like, how he embodies himself, how he shows up, like what qualities come to mind for you when you think about that?
Mm. I mean, most often, if that, if we were doing this in a group session,
Hmm.
I would turn that question around and said, "Tell me yours,"
Hmm.
um, and the wall will be filled with words, and we would probably do a word cloud that 90x% of us would agree. And they are men who care, they're authentic, they show up for others. It will almost always be about what they're doing for somebody else. Um, and there'll be some funny stuff of, that might be around sports and, whatever, but and some of it will be about being a protector and being able to protect those around you. But, I'm going to guess that 90 plus of it's going to go toward men who show up for others. You know, the the simple but the succinct summary of Buddhism or of Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy is, life's greatest question is, what are you doing for others?
Mm.
That's almost always where it turns on. Um, most of those will, some of those will be self-expressive characteristics, but almost all of them will be, what are the things that I'm doing right for the tribe that I'm part of and the greater world?
Mm.
And guys, I don't know if I know any man who doesn't have one of those examples of either a man who embodies that for him, or it doesn't have to be a man. I think we oversubscribe to role models. I think often the powerful qualities that men learn about being good humans is from mothers and their, and women and girls and their female partners and all the rest. And then if I ask the next question of saying, okay, we've talked about what about good manhood? Are any of those qualities only things that men can do?
Right.
And then let that sit for a while and go, oh yeah, we're sort of just talking about good humans. And then if they ask me for another half hour, I'll share with them my favorite theorist about why humans are the care junkies of the animal kingdom and how we evolved to be this, that our superpower is care. And that we are wired as creatures to seek care and to offer care. And we thought for a long time that that was only mothers and women who knew how to do that. But we now have pretty amazing kind of evolutionary and biological evidence that men are also wired to care.
Mm.
Um, so that they kind of, I'll leave them with a, kind of the mic drop around, you are of a species who was born to seek care and care for others. It is your superpower. And that's when I'll let the mic fall and let them hang on to that for a while.
I love that. That's such a beautiful message. And like you said, there's so many characteristics, and each
Yeah.
man, each individual, each human has to see for themselves how that looks and how they want to express. But I really love that reflection and putting it on the wall. Something
Yeah.
I might take with me.
Good. It's also fun to do with word clouds, and then you can, play with it like a Menti going on and just watch the,
Hmm.
now that we're of, paper works well, we stick that up on the wall, but, like letting them do it in real time and watch the word clouds fill up. And then I'll also use, if they'll give me permission occasionally, I'll show that to colleagues around. Look, none of them are aspiring to be misogynists.
Right.
Look at this. Imagine that. None of them were like, puts women in their place. None of them were about, can beat up somebody faster than his neighbor. Obviously, all men can be induced to do these things, but look at that when you ask them what they think is, kind of, what is manhood? 99% of these are going to be
Yeah.
good qualities.
I think it'd be wonderful to see more women in watching men leaning in and doing this work. I think it would be really
Yeah,
a disarming experience for them
yeah,
to be flies on the walls and to empathize with the pain that men carry and they express in often harmful ways. Would be
yeah.
healing for I think everybody. And I'm curious, as we start to bring this to a close, if you could leave one message like written on a slip of paper tucked into the back pocket of every boy and man in the world, what would that say?
Exercise your care muscle every day.
Mm.
Muscles, let's make it plural. And just, let him fill in the blank. What does that mean, care muscles? What are the, what, yeah, and just that. How would you, and then if, this boy or young man goes onto the website to go, oh, but just provoke with that, like, use your care muscle every day.
Mm. That's
Yeah.
beautiful.
I'll go with that. With the ambiguity that's there of like, what's a care muscle? Well, yeah,
I
think
don't know
about
if I've
it.
worked that. It's feeling a little bit weak, right?
Think about it, Luke. You know,
What gives you, last question for you. What gives you the most hope? Not just, intellectually, but emotionally through your work, the experiences you've had about where men and, a more beautiful world is headed.
yeah. I mean, we're talking about men and boys, and it's buzzing everywhere from Netflix to
Hmm.
all the rest. I'm Parents are very concerned about their sons, and I think that's where we end up seeing a lot of action happening.
Right.
Um, I'm intrigued by how much I think both fathers and mothers are worried about their sons. I see mothers verbalizing it a lot more. So I do think there's a concern now that we can talk about boys and men, and we're not going backwards on the conversation around women and girls.
Mm.
So I feel like we might have, we're not done. It's not like it's a linear thing that today we've passed the zero sum game moment. But I do feel like we're much more into, we can care deeply about how boys are doing. It's not a question. We're not going backwards on feminism. I will often lean into the fact that you know, I'm a girl dad, and I've had got an amazing relationship with my daughter of how to talk about a world that is safe for her, and break out of bubbles of whatever, Barbie foisted on her and all the rest, and say the world is yours, and I dare anybody to tell you otherwise. Call me into the conversation. And that's my full-hearted, caregiving that I do, and I can say I care about what's up with boys and men.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm encouraged that I think we've started to hit, you know, what Bell Hooks and Gloria Steinem and so many feminists said for years. We have to love boys and men, and as we love them, they'll become better humans.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that's the perfect note to end on. I love that.
yeah,
Where could people find more of the work or connect with you or learn more about what you're doing with the many organizations?
yeah. Well, equimundo.org has lots of stuff there. My TED talk was put together with
Yes.
lots of my colleagues here of how to just in a few minutes try to say it in stories and try to feel it. And I do think this is both an empathy and this is a data and an empathy, and evidence and an empathy. We've got data on what's up with men, and we always try to connect it as well with the stories. There's videos on there. There's talks where we're talking about just, it's both. We need the evidence to figure out what to do. We need the empathy to care about the humans who are affected by it. So yeah, go to our website. I think we do a mix of those two things.
Beautiful. Yeah, we'll make sure that's linked so everybody can access it. And I'm looking forward to that new book because,
Yeah, and
yeah,
yours too. So
yeah.
let's stay in touch about that. So I think it's more of, it's been hard to get the publishing world. We also need men. So men listening, men, buy books, please. because it's hard to convince publishers to buy manuscripts about men because men are not buying many books. And so
Mm.
the other part is I happen to like the written form, if not love it, as a way to tell stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction. And I think we need more men buying books. I didn't talk about my other hat is I write fiction
Mm.
about men facing trauma. Is what all four of my novels have been about.
Wow.
Um, those are on my personal website, garytbarker.com. And they've been my ways of making sense of men's journeys, trauma. They're all about war zones, conflict areas, high violence places where I've worked, finding an alternative path to redemption, to their humanity. And partly because I just got tired of the reports and said, I write a lot of them, I love them, but like just wanting to be able to tell free form stories about men can find pathways to redemption. And sometimes when I couldn't see them in real life, I made them up in fiction.
Mm.
So I think men, we need stories. Get the stories out there. So, Stu, thank you for this. I think podcasts are part of it. Let's convince more men to read powerful stories about men being our best selves.
Let's do it. And I'm going to buy your fiction as well.
All right.
Thanks so much, Gary. I really appreciate it and look forward to staying in
Yeah, so
touch.
back at you. Thanks for the invitation.